Hi guys, Miss Penman here. I'm going to be going through your social studies lessons for both Friday and Monday, January 4th and January 8th. Please make sure that you are paying close attention to my lesson. So you can follow along with me, or you can open up your own presentation and just flip through the slides as you hear me talking about the next slide or when I say next slide. So, introduction. The Great Lakes region includes a small area of Ontario and Quebec. Next slide. The 5 Great Lakes, which this region is situated around, are named Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, Lake Superior, and Lake Michigan, and it is important to note the names of these. Next slide. The roots of the region. First Nations people have always traveled along the St. Lawrence River to trade with other groups. Groups within the Iroquois Confederacy or the Haudenosaunee and the Huron or Wendat lived in this area. Samuel de Champlain founded the settlement of Quebec. United Empire Loyalists came in the 1700s, and many Scottish and Irish people came to live and work in the region in the 1800s. We're going to get into that more in-depthly later in the lesson. Next slide. Why do people live in the region today? So people love to live in this region because it has a very fertile growing season. Okay, it has a longer growing season because it has a mild climate and it has rich soil. Okay, the First Nations people continue to live there today, as well as descendants of Europeans, especially the French. As we know, Quebec is in this region, and Montreal is in this region. So jobs in manufacturing, tourism, and outdoor activities also bring many people to live in the area. Something that's important to note is that many people have jobs as miners as well because of the wide variety of minerals that have been found in the area. And again, it has a predictable and calm climate, which makes it an area that people want to live in because they can have a more predictable weather system than we do in Alberta. Next slide. Okay, so First Nations communities. The Haudenosaunee and Wendat nations formed villages near where their crops grew. They were farming First Nations. While some First Nations groups we learned in the Atlantic region were nomadic because they preferred housing that was easy to move so that they could hunt and gather, the Haudenosaunee and Wendat nations preferred to make more permanent settlements in their farming areas. This meant their housing could be more permanent. So these nations preferred to live in longhouses where several related families would live together, like grandparents, aunties, uncles, and cousins all under one roof. They would actually keep the same houses similar to how we do today until they were in need of repairing or rebuilding. And funny enough, while most of our society works in a patriarchal fashion, for example, we take the men's last name when we get married and things like that, the Wendat and Haudenosaunee nations actually worked the opposite, where if you married, you would go and live with the mother's family or the woman's family instead of the male's family. Here's some pictures of longhouses so you can kind of see how they would work and see some of the functions within them. There was the fire area, the bed area, and then some sitting areas as well. Often some of them had like an area where they would keep some animals for like dairy and milk products. Natural resources, there's 3 main natural resources. So we already went over the fact that there's minerals in the area, but the 3 natural resources that were most important for the entire time the region has been, I guess, discovered or has been lived in by First Nations people, they're a little bit different than when they discovered the minerals. So natural resources, here we go. Rivers and lakes. Rivers and lakes were extremely important for First Nations people to travel by canoe as well as fish for food. It was important for First Nations people to be able to canoe to neighboring First Nations to trade with them, and later they used the same methods to trade with the European settlers that arrived. Forests or wood is also a valuable resource. So lowlands or valleys in this region were once covered with mixed forests and had much wildlife. Animals provided food and materials for clothing, shelter, and tools for the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. Trees were also useful to the First Nations people because birch, cedar, and elm were used to make canoes. Farmland. So this is actually something that's intrigued me my whole entire life and something that sticks out for me from learning about this when I was young. So I think it's really cool. I'll get to that in a second. Wendat and Haudenosaunee nations have always farmed in this region because of its fertile soil and long growing season. So First Nations hunters had great respect for the animals they hunted, and First Nations farmers had great respect for the land. They would always give thanks for the food and plants they harvested. And this is the part that I really enjoy. So First Nations people who farmed in the area grew what was called the Three Sisters crops. And those were corn, beans, and squash. Again, another theme of femininity and a matriarch. So they are referring to those crops as three sisters because women were very important in their society. The colony of New France. So Samuel de Champlain founded the settlement of New France, which is now known as Quebec. But back then it was Quebec, parts of Ontario, and maritime areas in 1608. Many people came from France to settle in the area, which is why it has such a French population and strong French culture even today. Champlain and his men cleared trees and built homes. Then he sent French explorers to live amongst the Wendat and learn their language and their ways of life. And then he developed trade relationships with First Nations people. Don't worry about the note to turn to your textbook. We didn't bring home textbooks this time. Ways of life in New France. Life was centered on farming and on trade. Land was owned and controlled by wealthy men called seigneurs, and they were landowners who rented their land to the habitants. Habitants were French settlers in New France who cleared and farmed the land, and they had to pay the seigneurs to farm the land. They paid the seigneurs with part of their harvest in exchange for being allowed to live on and farm the land. Les filles du roi, the daughters of the king, refers to the thousands of young women sent to New France by the King of France. He wanted these French women to marry men in New France to populate and develop the area with French people and culture, and thereby creating a bigger French presence in Canada. So speaking of French presence, a common theme in our country as well as in North America in general, the French and the British had a conflict over Eastern Canada. So for many years, France and Britain fought for control over North America, especially in the East, despite the First Nations populations who already lived there. Both countries had established colonies or an area that is under control of another country in Canada. The British attacked New France in the Quebec area in 1759 and had taken control over it by the following year. They renamed it to the province of Quebec and created British laws that took away rights from French Canadians. The Quebec Act changed all of that, though. The British had a settlement in what is now Eastern USA and Canada called the 13 Colonies. These colonies were planning an uprising to become free of British rule. And we've actually talked about this during the Atlantic Region Unit as well. The British feared French Canadians in Quebec would join the uprising and wanted to guarantee their loyalty. So what they did was they went to the citizens of New France and they said, you can keep your land and you can keep the seigneurial system, which is not the system that we would run. You can also speak your own language and keep your laws if you stay loyal to Britain. We do not want them. They didn't want the French settlers to fight against them because it would help the French country, the country of France, to take over their territories in Canada. So they did everything they could to keep them loyal to the British. So the British created the Quebec Act. This allowed the French people to keep their land. By the way, the French people were called Canadiens, to keep their land and keep the seigneurial system of land ownership. And they would also be able to keep their religion, which was Catholic, speak their own language, and led to bilingualism. Okay, so bilingualism means having two official languages, which we still are today. They also allowed the French people living in New France to keep their laws. It was a huge win for the British, as the Canadians chose not to rebel during what would be called the American Revolution. And just to give you guys another recap of what we already discussed during the Atlantic region, these countries on the side here, the 13 colonies, they actually did rebel in the U.S., and they did win their independence from Britain, and that's how the USA became free of British rule. We remained under British rule for many more years until after World War II and the Vimy Ridge Battle. Who were the Loyalists? After the American Revolution, the residents of the 13 colonies who wanted to remain loyal to Britain moved north into Canada. Most of them spoke English and wanted to live under British rule, so they were known as Loyalists. They didn't want to be Americans; they wanted to be British. They wanted to be British citizens or under British rule. So they moved to Canada, but this caused some conflict because they disagreed with the Quebec Act. They wanted English as the only official language. They wanted British law. They wanted to practice their religion, and they wanted to abolish the seigneurial system so they could own their own land. The British government wanted to make everyone happy, so they decided to divide the colony into two parts, Upper and Lower Canada. So the formation of Upper and Lower Canada involved the splitting of the area that they had controlled as New France. So New France was now split into Upper and Lower Canada, and this map shows you what they looked like. What was the Underground Railroad? The Underground Railroad helped thousands of slaves escape from the USA to Canada. The term Underground Railroad actually refers to the secret system of people who helped African American slave runaways run from one safe place to another on the way to safety and freedom in Canada. Meals and safe places to sleep were then offered. The journey could have taken as long as an entire year to go through the Underground Railroad and into Canada. So if slaves were away from home for a certain amount of time, it would earn their freedom by running away. So they ran away to Canada and they sought refuge here because we didn't have slavery systems that were widespread and extreme like in the US. So they were able to run to Canada for finding their own way. The Great Migration was a little bit different. The Great Migration refers to 8 million British, Scottish, and Irish immigrants who came from the British colonies in Canada between 1815 and 1850. So many of these people were looking for a fresh start in a new life in Canada. Many of these people were poor in their home countries, but then Canada offered land and the chance to become wealthy through land ownership and farming. The people of the Great Migration were just as excited to come to a country where the laws were fair and just in comparison to their home countries. Here is your questions for the lesson. Please review the slides that I've just reviewed in answering them. You'll find all of your answers within the slides or within this video if you want to replay it and pause it. The first question asks, which provinces the Great Lake region is found in? So which provinces does this region take up? What are the 5 Great Lakes called? Which 3 important natural resources exist within the region? And how can the climate be described? So that's all in the first couple of slides there. And then the natural resources slides as well. Next, how did First Nations live off the land? Did they hunt, gather, or farm? And explain further. So go back to that slide about the 3 sisters crops. What style of housing did First Nations groups live in this area? Explain how they live. So explain about the multiple families and maybe even about the matriarchy that I explained. And then again, explain the 3 crops planted by the Wendat and Haudenosaunee First Nations and what were they? Which new settlement was set up in the region by Samuel de Champlain? Who were habitants? Who were seigneurs? Who were the Filles du Roi? And what was the most important part of the Quebec Act for Canada? And I put a little hint there, has to do with bilingualism, which we still operate today. And lastly, who were the Loyalists? What was the Underground Railway and what was the Great Migration? And those were on the last slides that I just reviewed right before coming to these question slides. You're finished, so please turn in your work. Thank you so much, guys, for paying attention. Please remember to rewatch, pause, and get all the information you need from both this presentation and this video. I hope it's been helpful for you. And thank you. Have a great day. Have a great weekend.